Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, while the EPA Ombudsman Bob Martin continued his Alberton investigation, the EPA attempted to control his office. Meanwhile, Dr. Cynthia Lewis Younger released the results of her clinical evaluation, and the EPA made plans to retest the environment around Alberton. We now conclude Part 4, Light at the End of the Tunnel, with Chapter 10, The Hearing. Epigraphs. They tend to shrug off our testimony like it was word-of-mouth hearsay or anecdotal evidence, and it's none of that. It's testimony. Paris Young. For the record, you're not alone. Robert Martin. The hearing was slated for November 11, 2000, in Missoula. A fitting date. They were all veterans of this struggle. Lucinda Hodges emailed core ACE members to rally input for the witness list. "Let's kick some ass," she wrote. She envisioned the hearing as the grand finale of their efforts over 4.5 years. In the dearth of media publicity, they knocked on as many doors as possible, informing people face to face. On Beverly Ridenauer's first evening canvass, she only got to 2 homes. People opened up like geysers, wanting to talk. As she worked Ponderosa Acres, Ridenauer received a surprise. Someone handed her a chunk of rail that had been part of the displaced curve, later called the handy rail. ACCEH also prepared a mass mailing for the Alberton area, as well as newspaper ads. They supplied Martin with a list of officials to invite. 2 weeks before the hearing, Ridenauer met with Missoulian editor Mike McInally and asked why the Missoulian didn't want to cover the Alberton victim story. The former city editor, McInally became editor in 1997. McInally assured they had written many stories. When Ridenauer told him about the Ombudsman's hearing and gave him an information packet, he said he couldn't make any promises about coverage since it fell on a Saturday. A week later, Ridenauer showed up at the front desk and said if she did not hear back from someone, she would pitch her wall tent on the Missoulian's front lawn. "Promise," she said. The Missoulian would send a reporter. The Ombudsman office had long puzzled over the lack of local attention. "I don't think they understand both the potential connections the media had to MRL and to Dennis Washington," Lisa Mosca observed. Martin's invitation told agencies that one goal was to review the emergency response and the testing, in part to guide follow-up testing. In response, Region 8 EPA complained about the short notice, but agreed to send Weiss and Way. However, when fresh snow socked in Denver, even they missed the hearing. The FRA, ATSDR, the local health departments Ellen Leahy and Tom Ellerhoff of the Montana Department of Environmental Quality all sent letters claiming they were unable to attend. Martin said the latter 2 letters were attached to one sent by MRL and turned in, quote, on their behalf. Martin speculated that MRL first tried to get EPA to cancel, then went through state and local government. Whatever clout Martin had garnered over Shattuck had significantly waned in the past 6 months of withering political pressure. Martin also invited MRL's Vice President of Operations Dan Watts and Public Relations Director Linda Frost, owner Dennis Washington, Dave Torgerson of Olympus Technical, a representative from Envirocon, and Scott Waldron. Among all the invitees, only Waldron and Torgerson planned to attend. The lack of official participation, what Martin termed a boycott, impressed him. "This is the first time this has happened anywhere in the country," he said. Informally, MRL did send one representative. Lead attorney for the Alberton cases, Randy Cox, sat in the audience. The day before the hearing, Martin and aides met with members of ACCEH and informed them of a letter he received from Cox. The MRL attorney argued, "I don't exist," Martin said. Cox wrote, "MRL does not recognize the Ombudsman's authority or right to conduct a hearing. The Ombudsman office ceased to have authority after 1988, Cox claimed. Martin said that 2 weeks earlier, Vice President Al Gore accepted all of his recommendations concerning the Ohio WTI incinerator case. The Ombudsman did exist. Cox's next big criticism about the hearing seemed to be, as Martin paraphrased it, "This is not full and fair. You're just listening to the people." Cox had questioned why Martin would get involved with, quote, active litigation as most members of the, quote, Alberton Coalition were litigants. Cox, it is our view that these plaintiffs do not represent the community, the vast majority of which is satisfied with the EPA response and MRL's handling, not only of the incident, but its resolution of existing litigation with them. Unfortunately, we view the Ombudsman hearing as a litigation tactic by people with a financial stake. Regardless of these points, MRL favored a full and fair hearing, he said, with much more advance notice. Meanwhile, for reasons he wouldn't state, Martin now seems skeptical of Senator Max Baucus's support. I think they're all working together. It's me and you guys, he told the group. That was stunning. But Martin was in good humor. The hearing was at the old Milwaukee Railroad Station in Missoula, now housing the Boone and Crockett Club. When Hope Seek explained that the B&C had stuffed animals decorating the walls of the rented hall, Martin quipped, I feel like the Blues Brothers. What kind of venue are we playing here? An aide cracked, is there a stuffed ombudsman there? A brief overview giving 2-day notice of the hearing was the first Missoulian coverage of any sort regarding Martin and his investigation. The elephant in Missoula's backyard could not be ignored any longer. Exactly 4 years and 7 months after the Alberton spill, the first full public hearing inviting spill victims to tell their stories was about to commence. The hearing lasted over 9 hours. A stuffed grizzly bear greeted all comers at the door. Martin was joined up front by State Representative Sylvia Bookout-Reinecke and State Senator Jim Elliott. About 100 people attended, many not spill victims. Bookout-Reinecke told the audience, I think the reason many people are not here is because they have a sense of helplessness. Nothing has come out. We have so many unanswered questions. Frenchtown Fire Chief Scott Waldron was the lone public official of those Martin invited to testify. Waldron said, there's been a number of insinuations that some conspiracy occurred to withhold information from the public. This is not the case. To the best of my knowledge, all information was disseminated to the public as rapidly as it was made available to us. At no time was there any effort on our part to keep the EPA or representatives of any entity away from the derailment site. Then Waldron immediately contradicted his statement. The first initial on-scene coordinator, and I can't remember his name, I did restrict from the site primarily because you need to understand that we were inundated by dozens of federal, state agencies, and trying to determine who could safely operate in there was the criteria that we used. On the first day, Waldron said, he alone made these decisions. Martin, but in no event, Montana Rail Link made those decisions unilaterally? Waldron, no. Note, in fact, while MRL gave themselves access to the site from the first day, at times without proper PPE, on-scene coordinator Tien Nguyen said Waldron, quote, claimed because of the safety reason he could not let the EPA team go to visit the site, despite that EPA was hazmat certified. According to Tim Murphy of the Montana Department of Natural Resources and Conservation, Governor Mark Roscoe told him, don't let the feds take this over, allegedly at the behest of Dennis Washington. Emerald Watts later testified in court that he and the techs made the decision to restrict EPA access. The EPA was denied. Garen Smith, environmental chemist at the University of Montana, next talked about his investigation into the mixing of the chlorine and potassium cressolate to form chlorinated compounds, as well as the white dust reports. Smith, I do remember conversations with the people who were doing the sampling saying they were having trouble finding examples of this white dust. Martin asked who told Smith that getting a sample of the white dust was difficult. Smith, it was Dave Torgerson from Olympus. He said, we've looked for the white powder and we can't really scrape up any in an amount we can bring in as a sample you could look at. Martin asked if Smith thought the cloud could have contained contaminants other than chlorine. Despite some volatility, most of the organics released were heavy compounds, and Smith didn't think they would disperse far from the site. Still, he thought reports of a pesticide smell and other odors likely related to phenols and mercaptans. I think those were the most likely candidates in my mind, he said, for reported odors from people, and I think that's what would be flying around preferentially in the volatile aerosol phase. Among the spill victims in the morning session, Roger Chalmers told his family story. He thought several derailed cars were unaccounted for by the bills of lading and that food on the train was contaminated. Lucinda Hodges testified that one of the main reasons for the hearing was to tell Montana Rail Link and the EPA and ATSDR and the Missoula County Health Department that the long-term chronic health problems that they said would not happen have happened to many of the evacuees. My family is very ill, and we were misled and lied to in 1996 about the possible long-term health effects, she said. Hodges' statement touched the heart of the Alberton complaint. Holding up plastic bags of vials, Hodges displayed the prescription medicines that members of her family took every day. None of her family took medications prior to the spill. Some of these inhalers are $100 apiece, she said. My family is totally financially responsible for these drugs. Montana Rail Link does not pay any medical expenses or any expenses for my family. And it's been almost 5 years. Who's accountable to the people in Alberton, she asked. Citing the START report, Hodges and Chalmers went on record that the EPA was not working in the hot zone until the 14th of April. Hodges: I don't think that should have been left to Montana Rail Link to decide. They were the polluter. Hodges wished EPA, DEQ, and the Missoula Health Department were present today, because this is the first formal public meeting we've had since we were evacuated, she said. And that seems like an awfully long time to gain any accountability on the record. She spoke of the visits allowed to the exclusion zone. As our friends and neighbors came back, they complained of feeling ill and headaches and not being able to think correctly, and that the area smelled like pesticides. And to me, if you can smell it, you're being exposed to it, Hodges said. For months after the spill, victims wrote the EPA asking questions never answered, Hodges said. Why are we sick? Why are we experiencing symptoms that we were never told would come? I think that most of us have been horrified that we were told there were only short-term problems and that we would be fine in a matter of days or weeks. And to watch your family over the years become sicker with each passing month and not have these answers is the reason we're here today. Hodges blamed Unified Command. We looked to them for the answers, and they were very clear that we were exposed to low levels of chlorine and should experience only short-term problems. For years, she had complained about her inability to live in her home because of the smell and contamination, which made her sick and forced her eventual relocation. Hodges: Montana Rail Link has never once offered to test or monitor or enter my home or observe in any way any of the problems, and neither has Region 8 EPA. I've made formal written and verbal requests in every way possible, and I don't feel any effort has been made to document what the experience in my family has been. And I know from my work as director of ACCEH, many other people who have just simply given up and abandoned their homes and left. ACCEH had worked so hard because nobody else would, she said. And the fact that it's taken almost 5 years to even have a public hearing is amazing to me. The apathy, the disregard for the public health in Alberton and the people, and I think because of the fact that we are rural and poor, we have been ignored. Hodges' testimony illuminated the key Alberton complaints. Throughout the rest of the morning, more panels of residents testified. Dixie Robertson read a letter from her in-laws, Jack and Lucy Martin, who had lived in North Missoula across from the MRL yard, and related how they became exposed to contaminated rail cars parked on the tracks, producing flu-like symptoms. Lucy Martin's symptoms became chronic. It's like something came along and swallowed up our life, Robertson read for Lucy. I have breathing problems, and I'm still sensitive to cleaning products, and I don't feel good most of the time. After the lunch break, Martin announced that Dave Torgerson, the senior engineer for Olympus, was scheduled to testify, but that MRL attorney Randy Cox had pulled him from the hearing. Except for Scott Waldron, no other responder, official, or contractor related to the Alberton spill would testify at this hearing. The next resident panel consisted of Beverly Ridenour, Dixie Robertson, her father Robert Sandstrom, John Zeimet, and Lee Schutter, father of MRL train engineer Billy Schutter. Ridenour and Robertson had been instrumental in getting some of the older residents to show up today. Ridenour emphasized that she and other evacuees weren't told to shower and change clothes the day of evacuation, either at Frenchtown High School or at St. Patrick's Emergency Center. She submitted for the record Montana DEQ documents about the Missoula Electric Co-op meter readers becoming ill. Ridenour added, Every spring, the smell comes back. Robert Sandstrom spoke next. Convinced by his daughter Dixie Robertson to testify, he'd never been outspoken about his problems in the past. He had recently gone through the ACCEH checklist of symptoms that victims reported, and now read off 29 symptoms that he had. Lee Schutter then spoke. He would soon make a most remarkable statement. But first, Schutter reported that he shared most of Sandstrom's list of symptoms. John Zeimet then told his family story, how despite living in an area not officially evacuated, they had experienced acute and chronic problems. He blamed the EPA and MRL for not monitoring the air further east. As Lucinda said earlier, if you can smell it, you've been exposed to it, Zeimet said. When Bookout Reinecke asked Zeimet and Schutter about their financial situations, Schutter said he had to quit his job at Stone Container because of dizziness and illness since the spill. And another thing I forgot to state, is that rail had been turned in 3 times before the spill happened. And now, that should never have happened. But RailLink has got their track supervisor driving up and down the freeway in trucks. Schutter had generated a seismic wave. Martin asked Schutter to explain what he meant that the rail had been turned in 3 times. Schutter: they have radios on the engines. Like I said, my son was assistant engineer. It had been turned in previous 3 different times. Martin: been turned in for defects? Schutter: defects, yes. Schutter laughed nervously. I'm not supposed to say anything, but sorry. Martin: thank you. Schutter: but my son's totally disabled. Schutter removed his glasses and wiped his eyes. Randy Cox had already left, or he might have leapt to his feet, shouting objection. The implication was stunning, because MRL argued in court that they had no liability and that this had been an unforeseeable accident. Schutter's testimony implied foreknowledge, which could have repercussions for punitive damages as well as potential criminal charges. Schutter's stunning allegation was never reported by the media, and just as notably was apparently missed by the attorneys for the plaintiffs. In addition to having access to the hearing log and videotape, the plaintiffs' attorneys had a representative present who would later say he must have stepped out. If a train derails in the wilderness, does it make a sound? As Martin dismissed this panel, he said, "You're very brave, and you do me an honor by sharing in your bravery. And also, for the record, you're not alone." Joan Crowder testified that she and her husband still suffered from damaged eyes, aching joints and muscles, memory and concentration loss, rashes, sinus and respiratory problems, allergies, and depression. "It's really hard to come here and talk because we haven't talked to anyone else," she said. "We have kept to ourselves because we've heard things about how people have been ridiculed. We'd like to have our life back like it was." Crowder was representative of untold others who suffered in isolation imposed both by illness and community. The next panel consisted of Dr. Kay Kilburn, chemist Wilma Subra, and Frank Durasso of Rocky Mountain Center for Occupational and Environmental Health, and Lori Goldner of Sage Environmental, contractors for the next EPA sampling. Kilburn reviewed his chlorine studies and his findings of neurological damage. "I think you can look at chemical brain damage as advanced aging, and we've used that analogy," he explained. Kilburn had studied about 40 different chemicals, and the brain had a limited way of responding. It dropped functions. After the end of the technical testimony, the general public was invited to speak. Glenda Giles commented on the health effects of chemical exposure. "The bad thing is, you look normal," she said. "It's easy for people to say there's nothing wrong with you." Giles listed the chronic effects of her own chlorine exposure. "I felt I went into an instant case of Alzheimer's, and I know those people have done the same thing. They didn't do anything to cause this. They were asleep in their beds and thought they were safe, and this got dumped on them and their lives got changed in minutes. They need all the help that you can get to them, and I plead for them because my heart hurts for them, for the destroyed families and the destroyed lives," Giles concluded. Missoula activists Tony Tweedale and Will Snodgrass then testified. Lois Johnson of Alberton testified on behalf of herself and her husband, who had 25% of his lung capacity left. "So that's about what the derailment has done for us," she said. "It has ruined our life, and we've been together for 52 years now." Larry Mickelson of Southside Road said, I don't believe it was safe for any of us to go back when we did. Mickelson had worked the night shift at the Petty Creek roadblock. There were many nights that the smell got so bad you couldn't hardly stand it, he said. Russell Gabolt of Alberton submitted a photograph of a brass doorknob that appeared to have partially melted. Anything that can do that to a brass doorknob sure can't be very good for people, he said. Heather Losh spoke on behalf of her parents, Russell and Sandra Simmons, and their extended family. She reported lung damage in her father, poor health in her mother, ear infections in her nephew, and her niece had developed asthma. Robbie Flynn said the smell had been bad coming off of people's contaminated clothes at the first evacuee meetings. She hadn't been able to tolerate returning to her Sawmill Gulch home. Flynn said just before this hearing was announced, her lawyers called everybody in and they gave us some more money and said, "Oh, here, early Christmas present." A rumor had circulated that plaintiffs in the class action lawsuit abruptly received an additional $1,000 each in late October. Flynn implied this was MRL hush money. Jay Stiles testified about his myriad symptoms. After we were allowed to come home that first year, every time we mowed the lawn, the whole family would have recurring symptoms, which included dizziness, upset stomach, vision impairments, and sore throats. So there must be something in there more than just simply chlorine, he said. Stiles also related the story of his exposure to the toxic waste cars and soil side-railed at Lothrop. He'd been to 4 different neurologists for his migraines and felt he was getting worse. I would also like to ask that we would be supplied with additional medical testing for myself and my family to find out in truth why we're having these problems, he said. Paris Young testified that he lived about 2.5 miles west of the spill at Sawmill Gulch and was not evacuated on April 11. He could smell at least 2 other chemicals other than chlorine during the first year. And the other thing I wanted to say is the attitude of industry toward the testimony of citizens is less than honorable, I believe. They tend to shrug off our testimony like it was word of mouth, hearsay, or anecdotal evidence. And it's none of that. It's testimony. Hope Seek testified that she went to evacuee meetings and saw people with chemical burns on their faces, to their eyes, and chemical smells emanating from their clothing in the meetings because proper decontamination hadn't occurred. Immediately following re-entry, I and some other people went out to Alberton to meet with some of the evacuees who had returned home, and we all experienced symptoms, smelled chemicals, got headaches, experienced kind of spaciness, short-term memory loss, dizziness. When we went out to Alberton and went into people's homes where there were carpets or draperies with chemicals in it. So the case for the lingering exposures and impacts from other chemicals besides chlorine, I think, is quite clear. The reason we're here today is because the EPA didn't do their job 4.5 years ago, Seek said. People are still sick, so that's what keeps driving this whole process. Lisa Mosca emphasized that many victims with health problems had left the area long ago, and no agency had ever accounted for them. Many other people signed up to speak, but left as the November light failed and a cold night fell outside the old Milwaukee train station. These were the public testimonies for the Alberton spill. At the end of the hearing, Martin made 2 determinations. The first was jurisdictional. Counsel for Montana Rail Link has argued that I have no authority and no jurisdiction to be here to entertain this case. I find that presumptively without merit, he said. The room burst into applause. Procedurally, Martin announced there would be a second hearing. He would again invite MRL, Region 8 EPA, DEQ, and others. He would provide at least 1 month's notice. Hodges had worked the crowd and was, as always, surprised by new stories of exposure and illness. She anticipated that the next hearing would attract a lot more opposition. Mosca had noticed that an aide from Senator Max Baucus's office in Kalispell had also worked the crowd, talking to them all. A second hearing was exactly what Hodges and others hoped for, and next time they would accept no lame excuses for officials not showing up. The Missoulian gave bottom-of-the-front page coverage of the hearing. Ginny Miriam reported on the Hodges family's illness and refugee status, and Lucinda's belief that people had been misled about the chronic effects of the spill. The story generally mentioned victims' beliefs that they were exposed to other chemicals and that there was a fire, Roger Chalmers' belief that 3 rail cars were buried at the site, the lack of dioxin testing, and allegations that the white powder was never tested. Other testimony received brief mention, including Lee Schutter's, though nothing about his startling allegation of bad rail on Curve 155 being reported to MRL. Miriam's story framed the question of what spilled and how far did it travel as the central issue for the approximately 80 people who have pending litigation, she wrote. In fact, many of the residents testifying this day had long ago settled claims, and the issue of exposure and health effects was central for every spill victim's testimony. Nearly half the article highlighted an external debate on whether the hearing was necessary and gave fair notice. In an interview, MRL attorney Randy Cox claimed that most of the people testifying were plaintiffs, and the court was the proper forum. The hearing, he charged, was a media show. Furthermore, he said 13,000 tests had been conducted. As for buried rail cars, the concept that happened with 100 witnesses from various agencies on site is absurd, he told Miriam. Note, the vast majority of the tests Cox referred to were pH tests and limited samples that were each tested for scores of chemicals. The alleged burying of dismantled cars took place after re-entry, when only MRL and its contractors were on site. In Miriam's article, the local health department's Ellen Leahy claimed that without information on what the hearing sought and its scope, she was unable to prepare and didn't attend. But Martin's invitation enumerated goals for this scoping hearing. The article also briefly reported on Dr. Kilburn's testimony of chlorine causing progressive brain damage in the Alberton victims, prefacing it with Judge McLean's October ruling rejecting Kilburn as an expert witness because of unscientific and unreliable methodology. The Missoulian never reported on Kilburn's test results and little on litigation. Cox, a friend of Miriam, was the likely source regarding McLean's ruling. Many years later, Miriam said, "I do not remember even being at that hearing." In retrospect, upon rereading her news story, Miriam thought it, quote, sort of weird that so many agencies couldn't make the hearing. Odd, she said. Despite Hodges' claim, the many testimonies, and the various allegations made at the hearing, the Missoulian did no investigative follow-up of any sort, or any stories featuring anyone chronically ill. The Missoula Independent generally summarized the testimony and the litany of now old questions raised by victims, with some specific allegations by Roger Chalmers. The article reported on Scott Waldron's claim that, quote, at no time were EPA representatives kept away from the accident site, nor was information withheld from the public. The article said some victims allege that EPA was either deliberately kept off the accident site or neglected to show up until 3 or 4 days later. Note, 4.5 years after the spill, this was the first mention in the media about such, quote, allegations, but even now the Independent did no investigation. The public record in which the EPA admitted they had been denied access, which Waldron even now acknowledged, was never examined by journalists, and ultimately the confirmed shutout of the EPA was ignored by the Missoulian and framed by the Independent as a victim allegation. Although bad weather reportedly prevented EPA representatives from attending the hearing, a Martin aide told the Independent that Region 8 EPA wanted the hearing canceled because, frankly, they know they screwed up, he said. Hodges said she talked to Miriam in a phone interview before the hearing. Hodges, she just said, it just seems like such a complex case and issue that I'm having a hard time understanding it. Once again, Hodges encouraged her to view Mosca's film. After the hearing, Hodges said Miriam called back and said, I wanted you to know how many people have come up to me and asked me if what I wrote was really true, if people in Alberton really are sick. I said, well, what have you told them? Miriam said, well, I told them from what I could see that from their perspective, this has been a devastating experience. I think it's obviously affected people spiritually, emotionally, and physically, Hodges said of Miriam. Despite Miriam's interest in the ATSDR Phase 2 public meeting a year earlier, ACCEH's press releases, such as about Martin's investigation, had prompted no coverage in the paper. Unless they were addressed to a specific reporter, press releases usually were received by the city editor, who would give it to a beat reporter to decide if there was a story or consult with the editor. Former Health Beat reporter Miriam later had no recollection of getting press releases about EPA Ombudsman Martin or of knowing about his Alberton investigation prior to the hearing. Miriam denied being overwhelmed by the complexity of the Alberton story because it was her job to understand the issues she covered. As the only daily Missoula paper, the Missoulian led the way in not leading. I wrote query letters and submitted news pieces, features, and finally opinion pieces beginning in 1999, with Martin opening his investigation. Every query was ignored without comment. Until the hearing, the Missoulian did no reporting at all concerning Martin's investigation. A similar story, or lack of story, unfolded with my attempts to publish in the Missoula Independent, which had shown some interest in Alberton, if sporadic. Reporter Ken Picard said he was never told not to follow the story, but had limited time to cover and investigate any one issue for the small weekly. On staff since 1998, Picard had seen Mosca's movie and thought the story had a lot of unanswered questions. I could tell these people have legitimate problems out there, he said. The Alberton story seemed consistent with other communities with environmental health problems. The same themes of people believed and not believed, victims labeled greedy. What's going on in Alberton is textbook, Picard said. For the most part, they are people of modest means, can't afford the expense of attorneys. It's David and Goliath in the courts. And once the story was old news, the greater community just kind of closed their eyes to it, he said. Picard had heard serious indictments of the Missoulian. That they are just really reluctant to say anything at all critical because of their close relationship with Denny Washington, Picard said. He too is critical of the Missoulian coverage. They've really kept hands off, except when things are thrown in their face, like the Ombudsman hearing, Picard said. With the hearing and long ignored complaints now at least on the published record, such as the shutting out of the EPA for 3 days, the relocation of the Plum Creek workers after general reentry, and the ill meter readers, and with the startling revelation of Schutter's testimony on the failed rail, why was the media still not interested? For victims suffering chronic illness from the Alberton spill, local media had been another black hole. If only ink. Lucinda Hodges felt Lee Schutter and Bob Sandstrom made a big impact. The media had mostly been hearing from women and the same ones. Such old-timers had never really come forward before. Yet, asleep at the wheel, the Missoulian and the Independent completely ignored or missed, or somehow missed the significance of Lee Schutter's allegation about bad track having been reported at the failed curve prior to the derailment. Years later, Missoulian reporter Miriam no longer recalled being at the hearing, except through a rereading of her news story, which included details of Schutter's testimony, absent the rail allegation. I don't recall that at all, she said, and you can't put everything in a paper that's said in an all-day hearing. But probably if someone were making that accusation for the first time at a public meeting, you would at least try and call Montana Railing for their response to that. Because that would be a serious thing. I don't remember anything about that. Miriam denied that she might have written something about it and then an editor excised it. Well, that wouldn't have happened, she said. However, as published, Miriam's reporting on the Sandstrom, Schutter, and Zeimet panel, matched with the hearing tape, indisputably established that she was at the hearing during Schutter's testimony on the rail, as she made reference to statements immediately before and after Schutter's rail testimony. Schutter's allegation was crucial because it amounted to a charge that the derailment resulted from reckless management and a cover-up. After the hearing, Hodges and others emphasized to Martin the significance of Schutter's testimony on the bad rail and that Schutter might be at risk. Schutter told Hodges that the EPA called him the day after the hearing, a Sunday. Hodges: Lee's feeling was that he was talking to someone on the Ombudsman staff, and they were asking him questions about that piece of his testimony, the bad rail, and about Billy Schutter. And I called Spencer Haynes, a Martin aide, as soon as I heard this, and Spencer says that they did not call Lee. And Spencer and we didn't think it was Region 8 either. We didn't think it was any EPA person calling the very next day on a Sunday afternoon. And I'm afraid the man was duped. I interviewed Schutter a couple weeks after the hearing. Was he sure that engineers had reported bad rail to dispatch 3 times on Curve 155 where the Alberton derailment took place? Right, Schutter said. They said there's something wrong with the joint, with the rail. So they would radio that in when they went over it? Yeah, Schutter said. How did they describe it, like a rough spot? Yeah, there's something wrong there. Schutter didn't know exactly when the rail had been turned in. I was just told that it had been turned in. I heard that this was the third time that this had been turned in. 3 different times. 3 different trains is what I heard. Did they say rough track, rough joint? How did they put it? I don't know. They just tell them they've got a problem. Schutter said that on the same day as the chemical spill, MRL had a derailment up by Knoxon. That one had been turned in 5 times, he said. Was he sure his other allegation wasn't about the Knoxon rail? The Knoxon rail was on the record as being turned in. No, he said, they said that spot there in Alberton had been turned in 3 times and the one at Knoxon 5 times. Just for the record, I asked Schutter, could he reveal who told him this? No, I can't tell you that, he said. Schutter said that when the, quote, EPA called him the day after the hearing, a Sunday afternoon, the caller identified himself by name, but Schutter could no longer recall it. They wanted to verify where I was, where my wife and 2 little boys were when they got evacuated, things like that. So the caller asked about personal exposure history. Yeah, Schutter said, the date it happened. Did he ask any questions about what Schutter had said at the hearing about the rail or anything like that? No, not that I recall. But Hodges said Schutter earlier told her the caller had asked about the rail allegations. The caller also asked Schutter for his son Billy's unlisted phone number. That's another thing they asked me then, and I said, he won't talk to you, I'm sure. I gave him his home phone and his cell phone, Schutter said. No real EPA employee names I mentioned rang a bell for Schutter. I can't remember, he said. It's that short-term memory loss. 2000 ended with the long-awaited Alberton hearing. The new year promised a new round of EPA testing. Litigation was heating up, a trial approaching, and Hodges and other plaintiffs apprehensively looked toward their day in court. Martin had promised a second, more comprehensive hearing. But Hodges, a battle-scarred veteran, knew better than to count on delivery before the package was in her hands. Sometimes the light at the end of the tunnel is another train. Next time on Gassed, the true story of a toxic train derailment, we begin Part 5, Derailed. The EPA releases its blueprint to muzzle EPA Ombudsman Bob Martin, threatening to derail all of his cases, including Alberton. Meanwhile, the EPA finally retests the Alberton spill site. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.